Redcap's Corner in Philadelphia once again played host to a Star Wars Unlimited 1K, kicking off the competitive season locally at least for Set 2. And there was a huge plethora of different archetypes and a variety of things that showed up. But today we're going to talk about what scored me a top 8, and that is the Lizard Man. As I mentioned before, I enjoy Star Wars, but I am not very well versed in the lore. So my little exposure to Bossk is his brief scene in Empire where he's, I guess, advertising his Feet Finder account. I'm not really sure. He only shows up briefly, and then I remember reading some books way back in the 90s where it explored a number of the different bounty hunters, pretty much all of them that had showed up in that scene and are featuring prominently in Set 2. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Lizard Man because he, as mentioned before, scored me a top 8 at this particular event. Now, full disclosure, this is not my list. I took this from the KTOD guys, specifically Chrono. So shout out to Chrono for putting this together. He, as well as other players, had performed well with this already. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the deck itself, why I chose it, and then my thoughts after the event. This is an updated version from the ones that you may have seen publicly, either from Gen Con or from Baltimore or from other events. This does shy away from what I think most people think when Bossk gets brought up. Now, for me personally, when the set was first released and Bossk was first revealed, my initial thought was, this guy is doo-doo. Like, he's horrible. It just felt like it wasn't really going to do enough, and I am pleased to say that I've been pleasantly surprised. To be honest, I started out, as many people did, with Boba Yellow with Set 2, and I had played it all of Set 1. I played it an enormous amount. It scored me Showdown wins. It scored me Showdown top 8s. It got me my previous 1K top 8, and I really wanted to continue the trend. However, I was struggling into a variety of different things that I didn't expect to, and then there was the rise of Kira. So even before Kira really exploded onto the scene in recent weeks, it was already giving me heartburn. So I went looking. Why are we playing Bossk? Well, this is, as mentioned, Chrono's version, which is much more aggressive. You'll note 0 resupplies. Bossk has traditionally, I think, been shoehorned into that ramp capacity, and while there is ramp here, there's a specific reason for it. It is namely to accelerate to an earlier Bossk turn to then set up a wombo play where you hit double quarry or double top target or double death mark, whatever, double something, and then just kind of blow your opponent out of the water from there. And this is in addition to the fact that you can get a freakish amount of untaps from Toro and Punishing One alike, allowing you to apply an enormous amount of pressure. So first things first, I think if you're talking about Bossk, we do of course have to talk about Bossk and the base. Bossk, as mentioned, can come out pretty early. He comes out naturally on 5, resource 5, turn 4, but can come out a turn earlier thanks to multiple ramp options, in this case 5. It was 6 previously, cut down to 5. Again, shout out to Chrono for the adjustment. The ping ability is incredibly relevant, and I caught at least one person during the event who did not respect it, and yeah, all those young Han builds, they need to adjust their play patterns because otherwise you're going to punish them for it. Additionally, there's a ton of decks that they run Greedo, and they're in for a really bad time if you're able to just blow up their board and replace with something that shouldn't have come out till the next turn and whatever. You can do some mean things. Then, of course, you have the flip side of Bossk. Once he actually deploys, setting up that second bounty. And remember, you can only get one. Carabast, I think, is still bugged, at least at the time of this recording, where yes, you could click yes and get 8 bounties in a turn. Don't do that. It's not helping anybody. just pick the one you want and then say no on the others. Getting the second bounty is obviously huge, but it's really understated until you do it. The first time that you draw 4 cards off Deathmark, or heal 12 off top target, or put both Punishing One and Toro, or a Phase 3 and a Black Sun into play, you're gonna have your mind blown. Just like galaxy brain stuff where it's just like, this is actually incredible. And it feels spectacular. That's on top of him being a reasonably sized body, and notably, with 4 attack, he is able to overwhelming barrage either multiple targets or a singularly large target. Notably, Poe has 6 health, Wrecker has 6 health, Young Han has 6 health. There's a whole lot of things that you just go, oh, well, I'll deploy Bossk early in the turn. I know you can't hit him with takedown. I'll barrage him and then pop whatever your big thing is. Your opponent's likely in for a bad time, especially if you can get the Bossk early. Now, let's talk about the base. I have given thought to moving to a 30 health base because Sabine, spoiler alert, is a tough time, and it kind of contradicts why I wanted to play Bossk, but we'll touch on that later. The conversion lab actually lets you utilize a lot of things in here that otherwise wouldn't be all that great, and you can tell they're not that great because when you have to play them without an ECL or a timely, you feel kind of bad. So what are those? Well, if you can ECL out a Django just to draw a card, sometimes you got to do that and it feels good. However, one thing that was pointed out to me as I was trying to figure out what my mistakes were in certain matchups, and people were commenting on the games, was that I was not aggressively using ECL enough. And I think it's important to point this out, that you need to burn ECL and think about it like this. How much life is ECL saving you? It should put you to 31 life, because otherwise, why are you not just running the 30 health base, right? I mean, it seems obvious in hindsight, and I said as much when it was pointed out to me. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you're looking for the opportunity to ECL. So there's 11 bounties here, and let's talk about the specific ones and where you want them. That count can vary. I like the particular bounty setup here, even though I have been prone to row them in favor of other plays, depending on the matchup, depending on the board state. Full sets of Guild Target and Bounty Hunter's Quarry, 2 top targets, and a singleton Deathmark. You can see in the board that there is, and we'll talk about it in more detail later, Deathmark and top target as well. Why do you want those? Well, they're all pretty much fairly obvious. In my opinion, you want to explicitly double the quarry whenever possible, although I will not shy away from an early quarry if it means that I can then slam 2 things in a turn. This is kind of calling back to my Boba Yellow roots, where it's I get to do more things in a turn than you do. I get to cheat, and you have to play fair, because I will spill out onto the board multiple 3-drops, multiple whatevers, and you have to play your 1 card a turn, whether that's removal or a body. I don't care, because I get 2, you get 1. And especially if you double it and you get 2 off the quarry and another play, maybe it's deploy Bossk, barrage, kill off your things that are quarried, double it. It is incredibly demoralizing to be on turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, looking across at a full board, and you have literally nothing. And there are very few decks that can claw back from that sort of position. So quarry, fantastic. Deathmark is, as you'd imagine, primarily against control decks, but it does give you an extra bounty so that you can actually get the boss pings or triggers when you need to. After the death marks, we have guild targets, or I'm going to jump to guild targets anyway, because there's more to say about the others. The guild targets here are kind of a catch-all because they are free. You can catch your opponent off guard, and it occasionally enables the turn 1 reputable hunter play. That's certainly kind of asking all the stars to align, or at least some portion of them, but it is pretty cool when it happens. You get a 3-4 on turn 1, start controlling the board early. Additionally, the guild target is important in control matchups because while you are more aggressive, you still aren't an aggro deck. Like, you're not Sabine. You're just not. So sometimes you do need the guild target push, and if you're doubling it with Bossk, that's an insane amount of damage that's getting pressured, all for the low cost of 0 resources and 1 action. And of course, there's utility elsewhere in enabling Django plays and enabling punishing 1 plays, and that's the case for all of the bounties. Top Target was a recent addition. It was something that was boarded, but I agree, again, Chrono pointed out, adding this to the main deck, I like the extra top targets, even against non-aggro matchups, so it's not Sabine. Say it's a more mid-rangey matchup. Sometimes this will break a race situation because you will be able to just set it up. I got to kill that thing anyway, or whatever these mid-rangey monstrosities are. There's actually a ton of unique units running around. I found this out the hard way playing Green Palpatine. Every time I went to command and I'm like, oops, I can't command that board because those are all unique. Now you get to punish people because you're going to heal for 6 to 2. Like 6 is good. 12 is bonkers. So you can do some mean things there. Lastly, Price on Your Head, of course, is part of the ramp suite. Only 2 now. There were 3. It boils down to this. You always want 1. You always want a ramp before the Bossk's turn so you can get him out of turn early. You almost never want 2 Price on Your Heads. The double ramp thing is not like you can cheat and look ahead. There aren't a ton of things to ramp into. And once you get to that point, it is unlikely that you're going to hit like 14 resources or 13 resources to play Ruthless Raider and Maul in the same turn. Like, what is happening that you ended up in that game state? I can't even fathom. But playing that one card a turn early is perfectly fine. So you do want price on your head. You can set it up with Bossk. You can set it up with a weird ECL play. There are ways to do it, but you don't want a ton. So I wanted to loop a lot of the early game together, but many of them kind of deserve specific mention. They also interrelate, so I'm going to end up with the whole thing on the screen anyway, and then we're just going to mention things and try and not repeat myself too much. Dengar, of course, pairs well with the bounties, but notably it also untaps Toro. We end up with Dengar and Django and Reputable Hunter and IG-11 as bounty hunters to untap Toro, which allows for extra damage or extra board control if really required. Ideally, you want to... The best way to stop them from killing you is just win the game, right? So you'd rather win by untapping Toro than try and stall by untapping Toro. Dengar facilitates both, but don't be afraid to row this guy. There are certain matchups where, yes, you would love to see him on turn one. Other times you have a 2-cost bounty and a Dengar, and it's like, am I going to find the Toro? Am I going to do this? I've rode him a lot. That may be wrong, but that's what I've been doing. Next up, we have Force Chokes. These are crucial in the matchups that they are needed in, and they still have value in other ones. Notably, they can't hit space. I'm not breaking ground here. People know this. And of course, there's a third one on the board, but they are imperative, and I mulligan for them against Sabine. Against Sabine, you need answers, or against aggro decks in general, you need answers to space, and you need answers to their flip turn. Their flip turn, you need to cleanly remove the Sabine before they Darksaber it, before they Wing Leader it or something like that, because you are red-green. You're not blue. You can't just go, oh, surprise, whatever, targeted removal to get it out of there. You're going to have to throw a bunch of bodies and probably, and more damningly, multiple actions in order to get rid of whatever said thing is. So in order to try and prevent that, we Force Choke, just get that thing out of there, and then you don't have to worry about it. Speaking of early game answers, we're going to talk about Kylo's Tie. Why is this in here? Obviously, we don't have discard outlets. We're not relying on saving ourselves from pillage or something like that. The idea here is that you can turn one, play this, and eat their A-Wing. You could trade it into a red 3 or other aggressive space threats. It's obviously not as great against villain ones, such as 7th Fleet Defender, but it is an answer to Lurking TIE Phantom, which is a nightmare. If that thing grows, it is very difficult for you to deal with it. Imagine that they buff it up and then you have to somehow get to an ECL'd Ruthless Raider. You're likely not winning that game. So I like the proactiveness of this particular answer. I've seen other lists run open fire or other answers, reactive answers, whereas the Kylo's Tie, in the matchups where you need it, air quotes, defensively, you can play it on one. And then maybe they just don't go space. And if it's in a matchup that you don't need it, you have a 3-2 guy on turn one in space, which those decks are likely soft in space to begin with. And at worst, if you're playing against, say, a blue deck, you play the Kylo's Tie, they play an Inferno 4, and notably that is unique. So you can bounty that guy up and slam the tie into it and get whatever you need it, whether it's on the Bossk turn or even before that, because they'll run it in before Bossk comes out. We already talked about Deathmark, so we'll talk about Phase 3 Dark Trooper. This went up to 3 from previous versions that only had 2. I really like the 3. I would love to have a little bit more Sentinel. Sometimes you just need to protect Bossk. I personally use Bossk fairly liberally, as in I will put him out there and I will run him in. I kind of value an empty board on my opponent's side more so than I do pushing damage on the early Bossk deploy turns, or like the first couple turns that Bossk is deployed, whether I get him early or not. The reason being is that I've found it is very easy for your opponent, if they have something on the board, to suddenly flip the board state. But this deck plays incredibly well from ahead. You're ahead, you can stay ahead. You're great from the bully position. You are not great when you are getting bullied. So Bossk, be the bully, apparently. Now, Super Laser Tech is the other portion of the ramp package. I debate between going 3 price to Super Laser Tech, but Super Laser Tech is very important for matchups where you can't necessarily guarantee you're going to land the price and activate it on time, aka to get Bossk early. Reputable Hunter we talked about earlier with the early play, notably Bounty Hunter, notably not Underworld. That'll come up later. I'm not in love with this guy, but sometimes a 3-4 body is a 3-4 body, and you just take what you can get. You got to pay attention to when you can make those plays. Even on turn 2, you could still slam the Bounty Hunter by going Bounty Hunter's Quarry. This thing costs 1 less. Hey, get it out there. I will point out, also watch out for your opponent's bounties, Dr. Evazon's, Val's, things like that, where, yeah, they don't have to have a played bounty on them. Some of them have bounties natively. Next up, we have Punishing One. Punishing One is part of the untap duo, I guess, the dynamic duo of untaps. Punishing One, I think, is great. It's also a great ECL target in order to eat those red 3s, eat those A-wings, whatever. If you have to pass on turn 1, great. Claim Punishing One, crush it, and then you'll get a 2-for-1. Or you can untap it later with whatever. You really do need to get all the incremental value, and that includes Punishing One on taps. And sometimes you can do that with multiple bounties where you get the Punishing One off of, say, Quarry, and then there's another bounty somewhere else, or you have one in hand you can play. Then you activate that, untap the Punishing One, and the list goes on where it's, oh, I trigger this happens, then I get to trigger that, and then this happens, and then... And eventually your opponent is just overwhelmed, buried in either card advantage or just bodies. Next up is Black Sun Starfighter. This is something that I added. The other lists were running TIE Interceptors. My issue with the Interceptors is they cost 4, so they are not fetchable by Quarry. Black Sun Starfighter is. It is also notably Underworld. There are a number of Underworld things, but the problem is I always felt like there just weren't quite enough, so I wanted an extra. That way you could redirect from Maul. Having a clean 7/6 with Overwhelm on the board is insane, especially after you ambush something. Notably, it also, air quotes, immediately impacts the board. Interceptor does more directly, and this is not strictly better than Interceptor. I think there's still value in it, but I found the 4 cost kind of clunky. Next up, we have the other half of the untapped duo in Toro. This guy is a big threat. He has a big target painted on him. Your opponent will almost always try and immediately excise him from the board. But because of Dengar, because of follow-up Django's, because of the Reputable Hunter, and because of IG-11, you can find tons of ways to untap him, protect him, and if your opponent ever lets you untap him more than once, obviously over the course of multiple turns, they are probably losing that game. Moving on, we have Jango Fett, who I gotta be honest, I'm not in love with, but he still is important. He's one of those cards that kind of like price on your head. I'm very happy to see the first one, generally. There are times where I end up rowing even the first one, and I just know I'm never going to get this guy onto the board in that particular game. But seeing multiple copies, I'm almost never happy. Yeah, every once in a blue moon you get a Toro reset, or really an extra Toro reset. For the most part, what ends up happening is you can try and engineer a scenario where you can ECL the Django in to remove a threat and simultaneously activate a bounty. If you have the price on your head ramp on the quote-unquote wrong turn, it means you hit 5 resources but only have 4 available to you. Then, yeah, you could Django with a bounty that's out there, get the Bossk, and then, you know, maybe not in that sequence, make sure you're sequencing right, and double up on something while drawing a card and pushing damage. Sounds great to have all those things, but he feels very clunky a lot of the time, and when you play him onto the board and he just gets played, he feels terrible. However, I will point out that his second ability, when this unit attacks and defeats a unit, draw a card, does not require the bounty. Just keep that in mind when you're playing this guy, because sometimes it's worth it just to eat something with Django so that you get extra gas. Next up, of course, it wouldn't be a green villain deck without Overwhelming Barrage. I don't know that there's anything I can add to this that you aren't already aware of. I pretty much never row these cards. Any game where you can play or even have access to multiple barrages should be a win. Like, they're insane. Next up is something that may raise a few eyebrows, and that's IG-11. The first time I ECL'd him and realized on attack you can split the 3 damage, it doesn't have to be the thing you're attacking, light bulbs went off, and this guy is bonkers. He's a 6/5, so he survives, say, punching a deployed Kira. That's come up on a number of occasions. 6 attack is a big threat. Going to 8 means that a barrage on IG-11 one-shots Darth Vader leader. There's a lot of things you can do with this guy, and that's before you consider the cleanup of, hey, I just play a bounty on the thing you just played. hang it with Bossk, and then you ECL IG-11 into your other thing, by the way, picking off that thing that I bountied up and getting the bounty. There's lots of ways to engineer that scenario, and all of them feel fantastic whenever it comes up. And of course, while you love to ECL this guy, because he's so sizable, just playing a 6/5 on the board seems pretty good. Lastly, we're going to talk about the two big drops in the main deck. That's Ruthless Raider and Maul. Starting with the Raider, I was talking about this offline. This is the reason to be red villain, in my opinion. Like, every red villain deck starts with 3 Ruthless Raiders. This card is insane. It's similar to Overwhelming Barrage. A number of people have already talked about it. If you watch Woo's video about Kira, he explains why it is such a pain in the neck, and every opponent I've played against when it hits the board groans. There's so many things you can do with it. There's so many ways that you can win the game with it, or pull you out of a hole with it, whether it's ECL'd or not. Ruthless Raider, I don't ever want to cut these. Next up is Maul, which is a card that I am probably incorrectly rowing more frequently than I should, but he can be kind of awkward. Because of the self-preservation effect, I found that I was going to say that I don't want more than one, but you kind of do, because frequently your opponent will have a way to deal with one. They almost can never deal with a second one, and even if they do, both of them have been pushing damage because of the overwhelm. And sometimes you just need it to clear something out. You just need to run them into something because their Boba leader is hanging out there. They have a Ray leader, or it's whatever. It doesn't matter. It has 7 health. You need to kill it. Maul does the job. Maul is the reason that I wanted to go with Black Sun over Interceptors or other comparable options. I don't know how much more can be said about Maul, but he is everything that you expect. So that's the starting 50. Let's switch over to the board. So we have, as mentioned, the additional top target, 2 confiscates, an additional force choke, 1 extra death mark, 3 Palpatine's return, and 2 Kylo Ren unit. I ended up using the board in every single match to varying degrees. Most of them will come in against what you'd expect. You want the extra top target, the force chokes, and the confiscates against aggro, namely confiscates for Darksaber, that kind of thing. Arguably, it could be used against other stuff, but that's the big target. Whereas the Palpatine's return and the Kylos and Deathmark come in against control. And the reason for that is you really want to have a high density of threats. You are an aggressive deck, but you're not, again, ending the game as fast as Sabine. So the reality is that you want the ability to just slam an IG-11, slam a Ruthless Raider, follow it up with a Maul, then it's a Kylo, then it's another Ruthless Raider, then it's and they just can't stop the hammers from falling. And these things, you're talking, it's air quotes 6 attack from the Ruthless Raider, at least the first time, and then the damage on the way out. Maul is a 7 attack, IG-11 is 6, Kylo is 8. And if you ECL it, you could maybe buff something else or buff him or what, it doesn't matter. Kylo also notably can one-shot an enormous amount of leaders. So if oops, I don't have an out to X, board in the Kylos and then just pop it off an ECL. There are ways you can engineer these scenarios. Now, the Palpatine's returns are just extra copies. Anytime you can play a Ruthless Raider, you feel great. If you play 2, even better. You play 3 and your opponent is just getting buried. What if you played 4, 5, and 6? It sounds like it might be win more, but the reality is what else would you rather play a lot of the time? So the Palpatine's return gives you extra copies of all of these different threats, and any of them are significant enough because, again, even if you get back like IG-11, he still punches for 6. Like, that's a lot. There's a lot of things you can do, and that's before you consider, hey, Maul's a force unit, Kylo, etc. The death marks can easily get swapped for top targets so that way you can have a little bit of extra card advantage. While top target does have value in some of those mid-range and slow matchups, as I mentioned earlier, it isn't necessarily going to be as important as drawing more cards and making sure that you're hitting all your resource drops without having to make weird decision and be like, oh, well, I have to row this important card for later because I have nothing else. Now you just draw a million cards. Coming back to the aggro matchups, and we're going to discuss those in more detail momentarily. The boarding plan here, as mentioned, you get your extra top target. I usually cut the death mark. The confiscates and the force chokes. The force choke is important for all the reasons we discussed. The confiscates I realistically didn't use a lot. I don't know if I really like them at all. Clearly, you'd much rather hit a top target or something else. It's fine. So the board overall, I'm pretty happy with. The confiscates are the main things that I'd be looking to swap out. And there is or are arguments to have the third Force Choke main deck, maybe even if you're expecting a ton of Sabine, extra top targets, but I don't love this deck into Sabine, which is as good a segue as any to start talking about the matchups. So the matchups here, when you're talking about aggressive decks, I think I'm okay against hero aggression right now. So your yellow Hans, I'm not super threatened by. They do have a clock. They can put pressure on you, but between your ramp, they do have disruption, so they can mess with you. Like if they strip away your particular play while providing a clock, or they yank that overwhelming barrage the turn when you really needed to play it, you can be in some tough spots. But they don't have as fast a clock as Sabine. They don't have those oops, I win hands as much as just slamming a Darksaber or going Darksaber, Poe, Wrecker, that sort of thing. I'm not as threatened by them. I am, however, concerned about both Sabine and Boba to differing degrees. Starting with Sabine, you do have a game plan. I want to make sure that I ramp at least once, ideally only once, because if you're ramping multiple times, you probably should have been doing something else. Ensure that you are getting to get Bossk into play early. However, that is not at the expense of mulliganing for an answer to space and a way to remove Sabine immediately. Sometimes you just have to accept that they will get you. But I think ensuring that you have an early ECL play, and don't be afraid to burn ECL early in order to remove a threat. Remember, like I said earlier, keep in mind how much life you'll be saving. If you take 9 from an A-Wing because you dirtled around playing something and then not attacking it, you went face, or you did other stuff instead of playing it, you're probably just dead if you take 9. Like, there's no reason to do that. So an early ECL to remove a threat, completely reasonable. The Force Chokes or other answers, even if it is ramp into ECL IG-11, means that you are able to then eliminate the Sabine. Of course, you could always just kind of chump block with the Phase 3 Dark Trooper if you can time it right so that Sabine has to run into it, and then maybe you can claim initiative and barrage it or set something else up. But it is important to make sure that you deal with that 1-2 punch. Space, Darksaber. Otherwise, Sabine will run away with it, and you kind of do need to, similar to how Boba Yellow plays against Sabine, you need to turn the corner and end the game before something goes catastrophically wrong. Now, Boba Yellow, up to this point, and I'll admit I haven't gotten many games in since the event, I just think it's catastrophically bad. Like, they can keep you off of a bunch of things. They can apply pressure. They have a better clock than the Han decks, and they have equal or more disruption. So they have McClunky for your price, and they have Waylay or Cunning or whatever for the super laser tech. You're almost never going to ramp. And if you do ramp, it still may not be enough because they can still just Cunning blow you out. It's tough. Additionally, their space threats might be worse because 7th Fleet is shielded. You have almost no answer to the fire spray unless you still somehow have ECL for Ruthless Raider, which is something to keep in mind. And the list goes on with, hey, Boba Leader. If the Boba Leader gets Boba's armor, you're like, there's so many ways that it just goes catastrophically wrong. However, I have not played it with the addition of Top Target main. I'd like to give it another try and see how this goes. It's possible because there are now, depending on the version, a bunch of named characters in that deck. If they're on Bounty Hunters, a whole bunch, but if they're on Bounty Hunters, you may just get Forlommed and Zuckussed into oblivion anyway. I have to say, I'm not thrilled to see aggro, but it is winnable, and especially is winnable if your opponent doesn't know how to properly play against Bossk. It's very easy to seize an advantage with this deck, and your opponent can get blown out because, like I said, you just double up Quarry once, and very few decks have answers to that. Against mid-range and ramp things, so it could be Kira's. I actually ran into a Vader deck, a lot of the Han builds. Young Han, we're talking. It comes down to, do they know how to play the matchup? So like Kira probably doesn't want to play units early. The Han decks have to play fair because if they cheat a guy out, you're going to bounty it up and blow them out. And it probably only takes one of those because, say they power out a Yoda, that's a unique guy. He's going to die quickly as well. They're in for a bad time. And you'll catch people with that because they aren't used to this. As Bossk gains more popularity, I doubt that'll happen. So against those particular builds, you can put on a lot of pressure, and you have threats that are not unanswerable, but they present dilemmas where there is no good answer. Ruthless Raider presents those scenarios. You can do some mean things. And that, of course, is in addition to the untaps and getting things set up. It's all going to come down to, can you ID what their big plays are? So for Kira, their big Kira turn. can you ensure that you don't just die to a Kira? Because you deploy Bossk, they deploy Kira, she blows up your board. Bad news. So again, Force Choke isn't bad here. ECL plays also not bad. You want to make sure you do deploy early because they deploy Kira, you barrage, and then blow up their board. And then if they have an empty board, they can't just barrage you back on the next turn. It's something important to keep in mind. The Han decks, we talked about other ramp styles and other things. Any of the usual late game stuff, and this includes Kira as well. If you're talking, whether it's Super Laser Blast, it's Avengers, it's Admiral Piet ambushed out, big things, whatever it happens to be, remember, you are an aggro deck. You are trying to end the game before they are able to end the game or take control of the game to end it. You have on taps what is going to get you the most pressure at any given moment. Look for ways to try and present multiple threats post Super Laser Blast. It's the usual anti-Wrath of God tactic. Whether you can bounty up their guy so that with a quarry, if they Super Laser Blast, then you can quarry immediately and get stuff, or you just sandbag 2 threats so that you can go Raider punishing one immediately following a Super Laser Blast. One thing I will point out, calling again back to the Kira, or just this could go for control matchups as well, you really need to be cognizant of not just Super Laser Blast, but more so Snoke. A huge amount of this deck either dies immediately to Snoke or is effectively useless against Snoke. There are ways around it. So, for example, if you can bounty Snoke, again, unique, ECL a Django in. Or if you already have an IG-11, maybe you can, because remember, he'll only be at 4 attack. You could barrage to get him. You could maul into him. You could try and find a way to off one of your Ruthless Raiders to help deal damage or adding on pings with bounties and Bossk. I've seen a lot of people comment boarding out Force Chokes against control decks, and I just don't know that I'm comfortable doing that with the existence of Snoke. Now, it is possible things like Kylo will allow you to find easier, cleaner ways out of it, but I wouldn't hate the idea of keeping some number of Force Chokes in postboard against blue villains because Snoke is just a beating. Along the same lines, I've had a lot of comments in other conversations talking about crate dragons. Just go kill them. Like, just end the game before they get to crate dragon. You have to be aware that, like, hey, they're about to hit the resource count they need, especially against Han opponents, because remember, if they cheat that out, yeah, you're not going to bounty that to death. You will be dead. But keep in mind when it can happen and what deck you're playing against. And again, just be cognizant of, like, hey, they can play this. So going forward, would I play this? Honestly, I'm kind of not sure. The reason I say that is the things I didn't like about the deck are still true. What don't I like about the deck? I don't like that it can, as I like to put it, it can trip on its own dick. It just sometimes says, I'm going to lose because you drew a bunch of, like, they Super Laser Blast and you just didn't have the option to prepare and you draw a bunch of bounties. It's like, well, I'm going to lose that game. Or you play against Sabine. It's like, I mulligan and I have 0 space and I have 0 Force Chokes. Probably going to lose that game. You do have a couple turns in both scenarios, maybe to draw into things, but the window is exceptionally narrow. Sometimes the deck will just be very clunky. The power level on it just makes you feel incredible. And it's kind of addicting. The times that you're able to set up the cool plays with the deck, you're going to be hooked, and it's a very difficult thing to walk away from. As far as changes go, there's a lot of things that I don't love about the main, but I'm not sure there are a ton of options that I would want to swap them for. I've talked before, both offline and here, about Reputable Hunter and Django's and a number of other things that maybe shave a number here or there, but I don't want to reduce the body count. Sure, you could add extra events, but having a turn where you just don't advance the board in this deck feels horrendous. It's again, calling back to set 1 Boba Yellow. If you hit too many events, the deck implodes. You need to be continuing to advance your board and doing things every single turn and then building up that overwhelming army to crush your opponents with. You can't do that if you're staring at a fistful of reactive cards. It has ramp, but this is not a ramp deck. So there's an argument maybe to include more Underworld or more bounty hunters or, something like that. The numbers are weird, but I'm very much in the camp of I want extra copies of things. There just plainly isn't room. I would love more copies of Timely Intervention. I would love another IG-11, that sort of thing. But where are you going to cut things? I could see maybe one guild target. Maybe. I don't know. It feels like a stretch even in that scenario. Well, that's going to do it for this one. I really enjoy this deck, although, as mentioned, I'm not sure whether I'm going to play it. We'll see. I have some locals coming up, well, literally at the time of this recording, so we'll see. But there's a little bit more time before store showdowns. I think that this is a great meta call into specific metas, specific environments, and it's just going to be up to you to decide whether that is appropriate for you. But this deck carried me to a 4-1 finish. We'll see if it continues to do so going forward. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. Let me know what your thoughts are. Have you been enjoying Bossk? Did you think I just got lucky? Whatever the case may be. If you want to see me lose on stream, you can check it out over on the Golden Dice podcast, or you can check out my stream where I'm playing Star Wars Unlimited live and have other gameplay videos. But that's going to do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Random Thoughts.